So in this video, we are going to be moving on with grid and start creating and setting up this grid to really just define the style that we want to use for our website. So what we're going to do is go ahead and get started with some of the two basic properties that we're going to be using, which are template rows and columns. So unlike Flexbox, we can actually specify the number of grids, the number of rows and columns that we want manually and create the exact style that we want to divide up our elements. So what we're going to be doing is using two special properties that we can go ahead and use, and what this is going to do is allow us to split up our grid into a specified number of rows and columns, which we can then divide the items up into and then start specifying the sizes and other parts of these items. So like I said, we're going to be going through and doing all of this, and as we go through in this section, we're going to be getting more experience with rows and columns and some of the other core concepts in grid that will allow us to really shape up this grid box that we have right here and start applying it in different places. So let's get started. So like I said, the two properties that we're going to be learning today are about template columns and rows. So pretty much what this does is sets up the grid to start off with a certain number of rows or columns depending on what property that you're using. And then from there, you can actually specify the sizes of each column and row. Now we're not changing individual item sizes yet, but we can actually go ahead and change the size of each individual row or column to create alternating sizes or alternating boxes which have alternating sizes. So let's get started. Now the two properties that we need to use, which are pretty easy to learn, are grid, template columns, and rows. Don't forget about areas for now. We don't need to know them. Now what we're going to do is set up our grid template columns first. So instead of doing something where we may be taking a function or something, this is actually set up in a really nice and elegant way. And all we have to do is type out the sizes that we want, and based on the number of sizes or values that we input, it will decide the number of rows that we want. So I'll give you an example here. Let's just say I wanted the first row to be 10 pixels wide, which is pretty small. And then I wanted the second one to be 50 pixels and the third one to be 10 pixels again. So what we're pretty much doing here is setting it up so that we have three columns because we've passed in three values. The first is going to be about 10 pixels, which is very, very small. The next one is going to be 50 pixels, and then the last is going to be 10 pixels. Now let's see how this looks. Now if you don't already know this already, columns are going downwards, not this way. So just keep that in mind. We refresh the page and you can see what kind of an effect that has here. We have a lot of empty space open here, again because we're using absolute values and not relative values, or at least relative to the box that we have here. You can see that our boxes here are really divided up in a weird way. So our first column is 10 pixels, very small. And then the second one it's getting really mixed up, you can see here, with our wrapping and all of this different stuff. And of course, we don't have those lines to show us how our grid is set up, but you can see that doing something like this would obviously really mess up the grid. Now, obviously, you're not going to go and set all of this to 10 pixels and 50 pixels, but you can just see what kind of an effect this has already. We haven't even created any rows yet, and we've already completely customized the way our grid looks without touching or doing anything. Unlike Flexbox, we had to actually really go in and specify it in a way that changed everything. So let's get started on the next one, which is our grid template, rows. So what's going to happen here is instead of specifying the columns, we're going to go ahead and specify the rows, and it works in exactly the same way. All we need to do is pass in a set number of values, and it'll decide what we need for us. And just one thing to note, these don't need to be the same. Imagine it as sort of a table here. We have three columns going downwards and three rows going from left to right. So let's go ahead and specify this here. I'm going to go ahead and say I only want two rows. So I'm going to say the first one is 50 pixels, the second one is 250 pixels. Now let's see how this looks. So you can see again, this whole thing has expanded, and now our first row is much smaller and our second row is a lot bigger. So you can see already what you can do with this, and the true power of using these template columns and rows, as I've explained before. But this isn't a really convenient or efficient way to create a nice looking grid, because how are we supposed to know the elements or the amounts of each device, especially with, all these different viewports and sizes? We need to keep this consistent across all devices. So there's actually a really easy value that we can use, which is called auto. Now, if we actually go ahead and set all of our rows to auto, what's going to happen is it's actually going to divide the space evenly between the three, no matter the size. And I can also even go ahead and do this with my rows. And now if I refresh the page, you can see this looks a lot better. Now you can kind of see how the spacing is working here. We have 3 columns, and obviously there's nothing in our third column for the bottom row, but then we also have 2 rows, so it's kind of split down the middle. And now we have our 3 elements up here and our 4th and 5th element down here. So you can see here that what's happening is it's dividing the space evenly between our elements or our grid. And if we did actually go ahead and remove one of these values and change it to an absolute value, so something like 100 pixels, what's going to happen is the remaining space is going to be kind of divvied up between the 2 columns. And obviously it doesn't look like it here because we don't have spacings enabled. There's a bunch of things going on behind the scenes, but what happens is the remaining space is kind of divided up between the 2 columns. So you can see already that with these values, we can create some really nice looking grids without even having to do much work. Now, what I would recommend is, instead of going and specifying all of our absolute values, go ahead and just create the number of columns and rows that you want while also using auto values. Because later in the future, what we're going to do is learn some techniques to split up our items and make them look a lot larger without having to change the size of the columns and rows, because it's much easier to work with our items rather than the grid itself. Alright, so that's pretty much it for template columns and rows. Now, like I said, just for any other exercise, I recommend you to go ahead and play with this on your own. Try and create your own custom grids and throw in images and all sorts of things in there. Play around with it and try and see what you can create. And just try and come up with as many cool, crazy ideas as possible, because there is a lot you can do with just these 2 properties, which are grid template columns and grid template rows. Alright, let's move on.